My thesis is The Economic Benefits Behind Rehabilitation by Chris Mullin. So, over the past couple decades, the prison population in the United States has skyrocketed, leaving many Americans wondering whether or not the volume of citizens we send to the prison system every year and the cost of doing so is an effective solution to reducing crime within communities. The solution can appear simple when you recognize the root of the problem stemming from an individual's upbringing, but the way America deals with juveniles, nonviolent, and first-time offenders is not an easy task to change. The economic and social benefits behind the rehabilitation of juvenile delinquents immensely outweighs the outcomes of a punitive approach. So, a little history of juvenile detention in Utah. Utah's justice system has undergone serious social and economic changes since its beginning in 1880. In 1889, the first reform school emerged in Utah, and it was called the Territorial Reform School. The main motivation and goal behind the school was to make the juveniles feel comfortable and at ease while also providing rehabilitative services. Prior to the introduction of the reform school, youths were incarcerated in the same system as all the other adults, turning first-time offenders into hardened criminals. The next step came in 1905 when Utah state officials granted juveniles the right to their own court that provided them with a more unbiased trial and a more fair outcome. So, a little bit more history. In 1977, Governor Scott Matheson created a blue ribbon task force to ensure that juvenile offenders were put into the least restrictive setting. This was one of the first recognitions behind the power of rehabilitation rather than a punitive approach. Then in 1978, Governor Matheson met with leaders of the Juvenile Justice Committee to discuss the ability of the industrial school to securely house serious offenders and protect less serious offenders. So the Juvenile Task Force. The JTF not only provided nonviolent offenders opportunities to change and grow in positive ways, it also helped with the development of the Division of Youth Corrections, which is still around today. The division is operated through the Department of Social Services, and it is split into 3 geographic regions. Each one offers care, community services and involvement, case management and managers, and observation and assessment for all incarcerated or previously incarcerated youth. In 1995, a social movement towards separating seriously violent youth offenders from low-risk juveniles began. This was called the Serious Youth Offenders Legislation and was enacted to expedite these particular youths to adult facilities and courts, which was another attempt at restricting juveniles offenders from becoming repeat criminals. So here we started to recognize the effectiveness of rehabilitation. A study was done by Joseph Steinberg, and it showed that adolescence is a time of heightened sense-seeking and immature self-regulation. Much of the attributed sense-seeking and differences in comprehending are due to the prolonged development of the prefrontal cortex. The importance of the study was simple. It supported the fact that although juveniles may have made a bad decision, the majority of youth offenders will eventually become a useful and productive member of society. So the policy flip. A study done in 1980 by Lipton, Martinson, and Wilkes, this study found that with few and isolated exceptions, the rehabilitative efforts that have been reported so far have no appreciable effect on recidivism. People started to look into the fact that maybe rehab was not the most effective policy. This shift led policymakers to rehabilitation was not the most effective policy in terms of preventing repeat offenders, which was previously thought. This promoted resources to be switched from rehabilitating youths to a more punitive approach throughout the years of 1980 and 1990. In 1980, Utah closed the industrial school and reallocated the resources into community and neighborhood programs in an attempt to have a positive effect on the recidivism. So here's a little graph about age versus crime. This graph shows the FBI index of arrests per 100K population, so 100,000 people. The majority of those arrested are between ages 13 and 18, a time where the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, as noted by Steinberg. The fact that the arrest rate drops substantially after the age of 17 proves that brain development has a serious effect on criminal tendencies, and not necessarily only criminal tendencies, but decision making and social tendencies as well. Understanding the brain is of the most frequent offenders is essential to understanding how to prevent youths from committing crimes. And preventing these youths from committing these crimes will also provide us economic and social benefits to the communities as well. So here's some econ behind it. In the U.S., the average cost of confinement for the average juvenile is roughly $407.25 per day. Times that by 365, and it's over $148,000 per year. However, we don't only pay to incarcerate these offenders. We also pay an economic loss due to their ability to reallocate into society. Costs incurred can be boiled down into many different aspects. Victimization cost, which is obviously the cost related to the victim, medical costs, which can be tied into the victimization costs or into the criminal or the crime committer themselves, loss of future earnings, property damage loss, quality of life is a huge one, detention and rehabilitation costs as well. So it doesn't all come down to just how much the average cost is to confine the juvenile. It's also there's economic costs behind it as well. Conclusion. So rehabilitating youth not only restrict the rate of unemployment, but also provides the ability for offenders to re-enter the labor market. The cost analysis of lockdown detention can be estimated to nearly $703 per day, whereas the cost-benefit analysis of the rehabilitation can be as low as $70 per day, and the benefit would allow them to get back into the workforce. Rehabilitation is not only a cheaper solution, but also prevents unemployment, repeat offenders, biases, nonviolent offenders becoming hardened criminals, problems with reentry into the workforce, and a lack of social belonging. All in all, the rehabilitation approach is much more beneficial in terms of economic and social factors.